Please join me in our time of prayer as we open our hearts. Dear God, we thank you for texts like this that speak from a position of honesty that is so clear and telling and humbling at the same time. May we address it in ways that open our eyes. Amen. Daniel Gilbert, author of Stumbling on Happiness, posits that it's the ambition of every psychologist to one day finish the following sentence, the one we used to begin with for our reflection. The human being is the only animal that blank. And he tells us how wrong other psychologists before him have been when they have finished the sentence with words like, the human being is the only animal that can use language, since some great apes, like the late beloved gorilla Coco, could use sign language very well. He also tells us how wrong some psychologists have been who finish the sentence with the words, the human being is the only animal that can use tools, since a growing number of creatures have shown they can be ingenious in manipulating elements of nature to get any number of things that they need or want. Then Gilbert goes ahead and courageously finishes it himself. He says, the human being is the only animal that, wait for it, thinks about the future. Here's what he says after that. He says, I've had cats, I've had dogs, I've had gerbils, mice, goldfish, and crabs. And I do realize that non-human animals often act as if they have the capacity to think about the future. But until a chimp weeps at the thought of growing old alone, or smiles as it contemplates its summer vacation, or turns down a fudgesicle because it already looks too fat in shorts, I will stand by my version of the sentence. We think about the future in a way that no other animal can, does, or ever has, and this simple, ubiquitous, ordinary act is a defining feature of our humanity. We have this ability, he says, because we have a prefrontal cortex in our brain which lets us project ourselves through imagination into the future. Now, something Gilbert goes to great pains to prove is that prefrontal cortex often gets us into trouble because though we can imagine what will make us happy, it often goes wrong in its assessment, and we end up instead miserable. Miserable with the choices we make that we were often 100% sure would be the best ones for us, right? Oops. Now, it's true, we make better choices when we're older than younger. Divorce statistics are very clear about this. But at any age, we can mess up pretty much big time when we make choices, because life is always, isn't it, always more complex than we realize. And the story we read this morning from the Hebrew Testament tells us of a decision the whole nation of Israel made that seemed awfully good at the time. This occurred when the people of Israel were ruled by judges who, when they were operating correctly, that is, operating with the best practices of the day, they consulted a god they called Yahweh before leading the people. But instead of being proud of their unique system, the people saw how most of the judges, seeking to streamline things, ended up cutting out the God part. And the consequences were often, if not always, troubling. So in this morning's text, they decide they want a king so that they can be, like all the other nations around them. In this, they are so like a young child whose parents are so proud of him when he's 5 because he trusts instincts which are very much informed, right, by his parents' superior wisdom. And then when he turns 11, he throws all that overboard when some charismatic 13-year-old Pied Piper comes along, and very quickly he becomes a very different kid. Well, the impulse of the Hebrew people to have a king did not begin during the judgeship of Samuel, who plays a big part in the story today. It comes along quite a bit before. In the earlier book of Judges, a hero named Gideon proved to be a military genius. And as a result, the people urge him to accept a crown. But Gideon proved to be as wise as he was courageous, knowing that no mortal could live up to such a high ideal. He says, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you either. Our God," he said, "is king." Then, as if to prove the point, Gideon's son Abimelech cruelly grasps after the throne his father had rejected and brings tragedy down on himself and a whole bunch of others. But the sting of that lesson apparently wears off very quickly, because we read today, "So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, 'You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, like all the other nations have.'" The people come to Samuel. They say, "Hey, we noticed that you're nearly 80, and the opposition party is always parsing everything you say, looking for signs of dementia. And your son was once involved in some ventures overseas that are chronically mentioned in the news in a bad way. How about we cut to the chase and get a leader who wants to be a king, so we can be like Russia and a bunch of other oligarchies where they don't have to worry about truth anymore, and power is unfettered by a constitution, and our king will say bigoted things all the time, so we can feel it's okay for us to do it too." Here's that text. When they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It's not you they've rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights." God's going to give the people their heart's desire, but first they're going to have to hear from Samuel how it's going to work out. I remember a lovely woman friend of mine back in graduate school who at 25 told me something very interesting in the wake of some marital troubles she'd had. She'd gotten married at 23 because she'd been so charmed by the weddings of a half dozen of her friends. She felt left out, so she found a good-looking guy, and in short order, they had a lovely ceremony. And here's what she said to me. She said, "You often get what you want in life, and then you're stuck with it." So here's how the warning sounded coming from Samuel's lips. And these bear repeating because they're some of the most profound words in the whole Bible. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses. They will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands, some of 50s. Others will plow his ground and reap his harvest. And still others will make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers, and who knows what else. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants and children. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkey, he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. And when that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you've chosen, but the Lord will not answer you that day. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king to rule over us. Then we will be like all the other nations with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles. Right. A king that will fight their battles. Good luck with that. Remember how our last president, I've forgotten his name, egged on his insurrectionist followers on January 6th, exactly 5 months ago this day, sending them to the Capitol building saying, I'll be there with you. Right. Do the people who still idolize him remember that? This is an old story, people, and it's been repeated over and over and over. When Samuel heard all of that, all the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. And the Lord said, give them what they want. You know, you can tell your children not to stick their fingers in the fan, but most of the time, the way they find out that's a bad idea is by doing just that. Oscar Wilde, as we heard, once said, it's perfectly possible to get what you think you want in life and be miserable. In this world, there are only 2 tragedies. One is not getting what one wants, and the other is getting it. Which is just another way of saying what we all know. That happiness is never having what you want. It's wanting what you have. In fact, in a TED Talk, Dan Gilbert, who wrote the happiness book that I spoke of at the beginning of this sermon, asks this question, quote, do you suppose a person who wins $43 million in the New York State Lottery is happier a year after winning than a paraplegic a year after his accident? Of course you do. But you're wrong. Because statistical analysis has shown that a year after those 2 very different events, their happiness level is measurably the same. Because circumstance has very little to do with happiness. Kathy Smith of Scottsdale, Arizona, might be Exhibit A in this regard. Listen to what she says. After 10 years of having metastatic breast cancer, I've gotten pretty good at minimizing my condition. I started out thinking, at least I don't have ovarian cancer. When it metastasized to my skull, I was glad it wasn't in my brain. Finally, when my condition became worse than anyone else's, I embraced my doctor's advice about not comparing cancers. They're all different. Some of my relatives and friends, God bless them, have a perverse way of trying to provide solace. They share with me stories about other people's misfortunes that are worse than mine, as if someone else's troubles were my gain. What I need is another kind of solace, something less combative, something more poetic. That's what I have in mind, she says. She goes further. She says, I'm a practicing Jew, and every Passover we recite a humbling prayer called the Danu. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that at all correctly. Which thanks God for the small favors that mean everything. The word Danu means it would have been enough. So the prayer goes this way. If God had parted the Red Sea, but not ensured safe passage, Danu. If God had brought us into the desert but had not led us into the promised land, had not led us into the promised land, Daniel. The point is that every step of the way we give thanks to God for getting us this far. If after the cancer had spread to my bones, the tamoxifen hadn't worked for me, well, Daniel. If I'd been given the abdominal injection called Zolidec, but not the yew tree-based Taxol chemotherapy, Daniel. Well, God's mercies never end. Miraculously, she says, I've lived 10 years with an incurable, life-threatening disease. And during this period, I've met and married a wonderful man. I've lived to see my daughter give birth to 2 grandchildren. And the current treatment allows me to keep my hair blowing in the wind. It's enough. Well, most of us are not Kathy Smith. Most of us look at the state of our life today and count up our regrets and overlook most of our blessings. Some of us are actually trapped by regret, right? Oh, if only that one thing had worked out differently, we might say. Or if only I'd made a different choice back when I was 21. This is precisely what happened to the Hebrew people in the time of the judge Samuel. All they could see was the shadow side of the bargain they had first made with God about being their judge or king. A bargain that had, in fact, made them a totally unique people, right? Ruled as they were, not by an oligarch, not by Vladimir Putin, but by judges. I guess they had expected everything to be perfect or something, right? And when it wasn't perfect, they decided to bail on the original bargain, decided to throw away what made their lives special. So maybe it's our expectations that are the problem. Because it's been said that expectations are merely resentments under construction. Expectations, resentments under construction. Garrison Keillor was retired forcibly a few years ago, remember, due to less than happy behavior. But let's not forget, he said a few wise things back then. One was this is probably my favorite. This is a long sentence, so hang in there with me. He said, some luck lies in not getting what you thought you wanted, but getting what you have, which once you have it, you may be smart enough to see is what you would have wanted had you known. Our friends in AA know all about this business. So allow me to close with a version of the prayer they pray every time they meet. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the simple wisdom to know the difference. Amen.